Okay, everybody. As the announcement said, I had to be home today, so I'm going to be giving the lecture for today on industrialization from home in this video lecture, and then you can ask questions in class next time if any come up, and we'll talk about the readings then. We've already spoken about how this background to the growth of industrialization in modern Europe, starting in the 18th century, this agricultural revolution with new crops, new techniques, new technologies coming along, really increasing farm production, increasing the food supply. That's going to mean a healthier population, lower infant mortality, higher resistance to disease, all kinds of things like that. So you're going to see quite a lot of population growth and increased prosperity going on from the 1700s onwards in Europe. Big increases in population over the 19th century. And also sort of a transition out of the old mercantilist system as the ideas of Adam Smith are catching on, more of an interest in free trade also playing a role here. Okay, so industrialization. It's commonly referred to as an industrial revolution. As with the scientific revolution, I'm a little skeptical of throwing that word revolution around too much, as we'll see industrialization as a process that really develops gradually and organically out of pre-existing economic conditions and spreads over the course of maybe a century and a half or so. Its implications are revolutionary. It's a huge transformation of the way people make their living and is going to have all sorts of impact on politics, on daily life, on warfare, on gender roles, on all sorts of things. Nevertheless, it is an ongoing process that I prefer to speak of as the industrialization process rather than speaking of it as an industrial revolution as though everything abruptly changed overnight. That's not necessarily accurate. Um, the first phase of industrialization begins in England. It's very much an English phenomenon. Around the middle of the 18th century, about 1750, 1755, you start seeing the first powered machinery going into use, the first factories start being experimented with, and as you get towards 1800. Um, so in England, starting from 1750 down to around 1800, that's your first phase of industrialization. There's going to be three phases. So phase one, 1750 to 1800, and very much geographically located in England. Major question would be why England? What is it that's so special about England that causes it to be the original place where industrialization is going to begin from? Why not another country? Why not, France or Germany? Why not, I don't know, China for that matter? What is it about England that makes it into the place where you're first going to see industrialization emerge? There's been quite a bit of debate over that. A number of different solutions have been proposed. One of them, a famous one that one should be aware of out there, was proposed by a scholar named Weber, Max Weber. He was Austrian. He's the founder of modern sociology, writing back in the early 20th century, around the 1920s, 1930s. And Weber's idea, something he put in a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Weber thought that what was going on was something cultural built into the structure of English society, which had to do with its religion, that England was the largest single Protestant population in Europe, and that owing to Puritan influence, there was a lot of Calvinism in English Protestantism. And Weber said if you look at the way that Calvinist ethics would influence a person's economic behavior, Weber thought there was a certain pattern here. On the one hand, it taught that idle hands are the devil's workshop. Calvinism tended to appeal to sort of middle-class, industrious kinds of people, and tended to bring with it this kind of a work ethic, saying you shouldn't be idle, you shouldn't be relaxing and having a life of leisure and luxury. That's something that the Catholics do, and that's something the nobility do, but the Calvinist, Puritan middle class should keep yourself busy working all the time. That's going to tend to make people productive. That's going to generate a lot of wealth. However, Weber said the thing is, though, that also if you're a Calvinist, you're not supposed to be spending a lot of money on luxurious living. You're supposed to be practicing a disciplined lifestyle rather than a self-indulgent one. So he thought that the combination of this Calvinist work ethic with Calvinist asceticism, a sort of life of self-denial that the religion taught, resulted in economic behavior on the part of many English people, particularly in its mercantile classes, that they would work hard and be very productive, but then they wouldn't spend the money on luxuries, on big houses and fancy clothes and jewels and spices and all these sort of extravagant things that the nobility would. So instead, so what do you do with all this money you're making with all your hard work? Well, you turn around and you invest it. There's really nothing else you can do with it. You can't really spend it on much. So you invest it in more business, build your business bigger, make more money, keep working hard to build it up, and this just sort of starts to snowball and turns into this kind of a thing. So Weber thought there was this kind of a cultural reason underlying what would happen. There have been others who have proposed sort of an intellectual dimension. They tend to like to associate the spread of industry with the growth of modern science. So they're looking at the Royal Society, they're looking at Isaac Newton and his admirers, people like that. Sort of Enlightenment circles of people, sort of taking this kind of rationalized approach to life. And if you take that to economic life, the argument would go, you'll have a body of people who are fascinated with new scientific ideas, fascinated with new technologies, wanting to rationalize the economy the same as they rationalize everything else. And that creates the conditions which are going to give rise to industrialization as well. So you sort of have these different, kind of cultural arguments. Weber's idea that Protestantism is shaping it. Other people, sorry, don't have a specific scholar in mind, but a school of thought out there that would argue this is kind of an intellectual culture that's going on. Um, the problem is that those don't necessarily do all that good a job of explaining why England in particular, rather than some of the other countries of Europe. If you look at France, for example, France has its own equivalent. It's the Académie des Sciences, equivalent to the Royal Society. Although France is a Catholic country, it is very invested in the pursuit of science and develops a quite vigorous scientific community. So, okay, England is, and it's got lots of Enlightenment philosophers and a lot of Enlightenment culture in France as well. So England isn't all that unique there. And you get other areas where you have the same kind of religious Puritan, well, not Puritanism per se, but same kind of Protestant culture. In Scandinavia, for example, parts of Germany also have it, and you don't have the sort of Weberian idea that this is going to give rise to capitalism in industry in those places. So these are sort of popular ideas and worth thinking about. There may be something in them, but maybe there's something else. In the more recent scholarship, a scholar named Robert Allen has proposed a different kind of a solution to what's going on. He says, let's look at the actual economics of England in the 1700s and ask what's going on there. And he says, if you look at the English economy, you'll start noticing some distinctive features to it. In particular, the cost of living in England compared to other countries in Europe, or for that matter elsewhere in the world, is quite high. If you sort of imagine, he calls it a basket, sort of a basket of goods and services a person needs to survive, sort of your survival level, goods that you would need to acquire in terms of food and shelter and so forth, and then your maybe thriving level, the bigger basket you would need to say you're having a life of, prosperity. In England, all that stuff just costs more than elsewhere. And related to that is also the fact that in England, wages are relatively high. Workers get paid more there than elsewhere. For a variety of reasons. It goes back into the Middle Ages and the development of English trade and, a whole bunch of different factors there, which we don't need to worry about here. But basically, in the 1700s, British workers cost more. They're getting paid better, but they also have higher costs of living than in other parts of Europe. And Allen argues that that is going to be one fundamental factor that's going to make a big difference. So sort of the high cost of living, high wages is one side. The other side of Allen's argument is basically geographic, just by sheer luck. England happens to have plentiful natural supplies of coal, thanks to its geology, compared to other areas, and relatively limited forest land, being an island and all, and not all that big. It has forests, but not quite the vast sweeping forests of Germany or France. And that's important because if you think about energy sources, if you think about ways to, say, generate heat, most people would rather burn wood than coal to heat their homes with, right? How many of you think about going home for Christmas and we'll all gather together around the coal fire? Nobody does that. People burn wood, and there's a reason for that. Has to do with the smell, has to do with pollution. Coal is nasty, dirty stuff, and most people prefer not to use it. Excuse me. Um, but of course, because of that, coal is generally cheaper than wood. Wood is more expensive. And again, in a place like England with relatively limited forests, wood is even more expensive, and the gap in the expense between wood and coal is that much greater in England than it is elsewhere. Because of which, particularly for poorer families in England, people had resorted, were more likely to resort to coal burning stoves to heat their homes with, things like that. And so you sort of had a bit of a coal burning um, technology in place. People sort of developed coal burning stoves and things like that to heat their homes with or cook on and things like that. They were widespread, they were affordable, they worked pretty well compared to what was available in other countries where wood was not quite so expensive and coal was not quite so plentiful. Okay, so you put all these together, what does it mean? It means that anywhere in Europe, right? France, Germany, Denmark, England, you may have somebody who's a member of a scientific society, who's got enlightenment, rationalistic ideas, who's thinking about ways to, come up with a new gadget, with a new invention, a new device, which might have some kind of a practical purpose. And you're going to find that everywhere. The English are as inventive as everybody else, but they're not necessarily more inventive. But you're going to have a difference in that when people invent a technology, there's an initial sort of breakthrough stage where they, come up with the big idea, but then you also need a follow-up process of research and development to take the big idea and turn it into something affordable and practical that will actually do the job in a sufficiently efficient way that it will, be economically beneficial for people. And that takes time, and that takes patience, and that takes a certain investment of money. You're going to need to spend quite a bit on this for something that may turn out not to pan out at all, right? To implement technological solutions to problems is an expensive process. Okay, so the question is, if you sort of imagine a businessman, a merchant or producer, some guy operating a mine or, wanting to generate, manufacture textiles or something like that. Suppose you got like a cloth merchant. Let's sort of imagine somebody who is used to sort of hiring weavers, who are going to work in their workshops back at home, with their looms and they're weaving thread into cloth or something like that. Well, if you want to increase your production, right, and start doing more, making more money, you see an opportunity to, expand your market some. If you're living in Italy or France or Germany, and you ask what's the most cost-effective way to start ramping up production, um, in those countries, you're going to probably just hire more weavers, right? You're going to hire more workers, just get more people going on because labor's relatively cheap. In the simplest way, most straightforward way to get your business producing more is just to get more people producing it. That's a pretty straightforward kind of approach that you can take. So in most places, you're just going to hire more people. But in England, it's a little bit different because in England, hiring more people is going to cost a lot more money than hiring more people in France is going to do, let alone more in Germany or Italy or, China or India for that matter. Alan actually tried to get some numbers to other countries around the world as well as just England, and came up with this conclusion that in these other places, just the workers are far cheaper, easier to hire workers, whereas in England, workers are expensive to hire. And since workers are expensive to hire, you're going to be more open to investing money in machinery that might save labor, that might enable you to hire fewer workers, and have the machine do the work that previously was being done by people, or at least additional machines so you don't have to hire additional people. Because the coal that you're going to use to power the machines is relatively cheap, because the workers are expensive, this is going to seem like a worthwhile investment to get the machine up and running. Okay, so that's the idea. So fundamentally, an economic equation there that Alan is saying. It's not so much English Puritanism, it's not Enlightenment intellectual activity. Those are going on in lots of different countries. What's unique about England is this particular economic equation of cheap coal with expensive labor. right? You put those together and it starts making sense to people to start investing in the machinery that the scientists are coming up with to actually apply it to economic functions. Okay, so what kinds of machinery are they investing in? There's really a whole variety of things. When I was talking about the agricultural revolution, I alluded to um, some of the things that are going on there. You're getting sort of harvesting machines and winnowing machines and threshing machines. Some of them were hand operated, but still mechanizing the process, on the basis of manual labor, just to, enable farmers to do their work more efficiently and productively than if they were using just a hand scythe or a threshing rod or something like that, like they used to do. You could sort of mechanize that process a little bit and make it more effective that way. So that's one thing you can do. Uh, Agricultural things. You get various areas. Interest in mining, in particular, mines have a problem that they tend to fill up with water, and so if you could get a mechanical pump to get the water out of your wells, the mining industry is going to be interested in that. But in particular, where you're going to get a lot of interest in machinery is going to be in the textile business. And this fits the English setting as well. Again, going way back into the Middle Ages, English trade had a lot to do with the wool industry and with the textile industry. The sort of the hill country in England was a great area for grazing sheep, as well as up in Scotland. So England generated a lot of wool. The big towns of southern England, London and Winchester and places like that, they're all sort of wool manufacturing places where the raw wool is getting spun into thread and woven into cloth, and then the cloth is getting exported and things like that. And that's a process going on. So you're getting new machines. You're getting a mechanical loom. You're getting something called a spinning jenny to speed up the process of spinning the thread. You're going to get brought over from America, 1792. It's a classic case of what we're talking about. The cotton gin, prior to 1792, cotton had been an extremely expensive luxury fabric because you had to pick all the seeds out of the cotton by hand to make it wearable, and that made it very expensive, very labor-intensive. An American, Eli Whitney in Connecticut, invents a machine that could comb this out, but it becomes industrially applied, not in America, but in England. It's going to be another 30 years before you start getting American factories using cotton gins on a large scale. But the English pick up on, American inventor, but they pick up on it and invest in it and start using it in textile factories. So that's sort of a classic case of showing how, you could get the technological inventions, the intellectual work anywhere, including, in the newly independent United States. But to actually have that translate into industrial applications, that's something that requires the economic background and something that's going to happen in England, not in America initially. Okay, so textile industry is really probably going to be the biggest thing. And then, of course, behind all this, the steam engine. It's not an engine yet, but steam power. The idea that you can burn coal, use it to boil water. The boiling water generates steam. You force the steam through pipes. The pipes turn turbines. The turbines make the machinery work. Right. You can take all these various machines, cotton gins and spinning jennies and mechanical pumps for wells and threshing machines and all this stuff, and you could hook it up to a steam engine and drive it that way rather than having to have a person crank it by hand or whatever, and that's going to speed up the whole process immensely. Right. So industrialization starts spreading in England from the 1750s. You're seeing these applications starting to come along, and it's really pretty well established by 1800 or so. Now, of course, one thing that's a factor of all this, which we'll talk about a bit more in the future, is that it is going to mean it's going to change the place of work. Prior to this, most people had a workplace that was connected to their home, right? The household was the economic producing unit. If you think about a farm, you've got the farmhouse, the land around it, the farmstead is your economic unit. The same thing was true of craft production, right? Most craftspeople, coopers and shoemakers and, weavers and all these people, spinners, they were generally using workshops that were attached to their home or incorporated into their home and so forth, right? So the home was the natural um, what's the word I'm looking for? Was the economic unit, the producing unit, the production center. However, you're not going to go hooking up a coal burning steam plant in individual people's households, right? Individual people can't afford that. It wouldn't be a very good use of the energy. So instead, you're going to build a central location with a power plant and a smokestack. And then the power plant is the coal boiler is going to get hooked up to whole sets of machinery because it's powerful enough to drive a lot of them at once. You're going to bring workers out of their homes to go down to that place and work on the machines. And lo and behold, you've invented the factory, right? And this is really going to be very socially and culturally significant, right? Sort of the idea that the workplace is no longer part of your home. You now leave your home to go to the workplace. And we'll talk about that more in a future class. Okay, so that's sort of first wave industrialization starting in Britain. All right. Sorry. Now, thinking about industrialization after that, the future waves, you need to think sort of moving chronologically into later periods. You're going to start moving geographically into other parts of the world, and you're also going to see shifts in the kinds of products that are coming out of industrial production. Okay, so sort of three areas to think about as we talk about phases. The first wave, the time, the chronology was 1750 to 1800. The place was England. The products were steam power, mechanized devices, particularly for textile production, but also, like we say, some of these other areas as well. Second phase is going to come along. England is going to kind of get established and be running along for a generation or so after 1800. The second phase you're going to start seeing happening around 1820 or so. Okay, and it's going to keep on running down to maybe 1850, 1860. Okay, so second phase, chronologically, the generation from 1820 down to maybe 1860, let's call it about there. Now, obviously, there's no one event which, marks the end of one of these phases, but just sort of by then, the new development has taken its course. Geographically, this is about the spread of industrialization to additional countries, just a few initially largely in Northern and Western Europe, France, Germany, the Netherlands, places like that, not a whole lot of other parts of Europe, and the United States. From 1820 or so, you start seeing the beginning of industrialization in the United States. The first factories going up in New England. I've heard the very first might have been in Rhode Island, but traditionally what I've normally heard is that Lowell, Massachusetts is the first real American industrial center. So that's going to be a major area to sort of think about, actually, right on our doorstep here, just down the road in Lowell. Okay, so factory systems going up there. Yeah, I'll talk about products in a moment. Sorry. The thing to think about as far as this geographic spread goes is that once you've had a good couple of generations of industry going on in England, the English have essentially done the really expensive, time-consuming research and development work, right? They've sort of already come up with these inventions or borrowed inventions from elsewhere. They've done all the process of refining them and perfecting them and making them more efficient and more cost-effective. And they've sort of got them up and running and demonstrated you can actually make money doing this. And what that does is it lowers the threshold for business people in other countries, right? Sort of in that first phase, like we were saying, it happened in England because England was where labor was so expensive and that it wasn't worth the investment in the technology, right? You could just hire more workers for cheap. But as the English do the research and development work, what that means is that the level of investment you need to make in order to acquire industrial technology starts going down. So the balance of cost of labor versus cost of machinery starts to balance out, and it starts to get to the point where people start discovering they can invest in technology, and they're going to find that it's going to be beneficial for them. So yeah, so from about 1820 or so, first, French, German, Dutch, American business people start saying, okay, we're also going to start making the shift out of sort of household-based craft production and start shifting over into factory-based industrial production, basically just buying machinery from England or buying engineers from England or making trips to England to observe what they're using and then coming back with the ideas and implementing it at home. Okay, so excuse me. Okay, so that's what's happening as far as the geographic spread goes. My daughter isn't the only one who's been sick. I'm also trying to recover from this cough a bit myself. Okay. The other thing, third area, right? So the chronology, about 1820 to 1860. The geography, France, Germany, Netherlands, America. Products, you also get some new industrial production getting focused on here. And in particular, people start working with the idea of taking these steam engines and linking them up to transportation. Okay, sort of transportation is going to be the big new story of this first half of the 19th century, right? This 1820 to 1860 period in a lot of different areas. Two different ways you can do it. One, you can put a steam engine on a boat and hook it up to a paddle wheel or to a propeller, and thereby invent the steamship. It's going to be very important. Steamships don't depend on the wind like older style of ships do. They can operate with a smaller crew. They travel faster. They can carry heavier cargoes than the sailing ships used to be able to do. Just, sort of revolutionizes the shipping industry in terms of its speed, its independence, not complete independence, but relative independence from the weather. The sheer bulk of goods it can transport. So that's going to be one major area. The other, on land, is to hook up the steam engine to a set of wheels. The automobile is still in the future. You can't really drive these very independently on the sort of dirt roads of the time very well. But if you lay down some steel tracks, you can get a railroad going. And so railroad technology. And again, similarly, once the railroads get in place, they travel incredibly faster, able to transport much larger numbers of people or quantities of cargo much more rapidly and cheaper than used to be the case when you used to have to carry stuff on your back or on a horse's back or on a cart or something like that, or a wagon. So the railroad is going to revolutionize land transportation. You see this a lot in the writings of the time. People get really excited about the idea of technological progress and sort of the railroad tracks cutting across the countryside, steamships going across the ocean. These sort of become the symbols of modernity, the symbols of progress, the symbols of a new era coming along that people are going to be quite preoccupied with in some ways, and really take a very strong interest in. We sort of kind of European pride, and Europeans will talk about this as a sign of their superiority to other cultures in the world that don't have railroads and steamships. Um, okay, so these new transportation, obviously this is going to mean that people can transport as well. You get a lot more mobility as people start moving from place to place using the new ships and the new railroads. It's also going to transform commerce in some important ways. When we talked about really long distance trade, global trade beforehand, the kind of thing that Columbus and Vasco da Gama were coming from, it was really trade in luxury goods, right? You were going off to exotic places to get exotic goods like silk and spices and jewels and perfumes and ivory and things like that. Sort of exotic, unusual goods, because the ships were small, transportation was slow and dangerous, and in order to justify the risk and the expense that you could get from a small cargo, that small cargo had to carry very high value. So you kind of had to focus on these luxury goods, and the sort of small scale luxury trade was really what international commerce had been about for centuries and centuries and centuries over long distances. Um, Trading in bulk goods, things like grain or wood or iron, that was the kind of thing that you only did locally, right? Where the transportation costs were not so high, and so the vast bulk of sort of large scale trade and staples and fundamentals of existence, those were only done on very local kind of a basis. Well, the railroad and the steamship transformed that. Right. Now it's going to be, because they are bigger, because they have more cargo capacity to fill, because they are faster and cheaper to operate and need fewer people to operate them. They start making it more cost effective to move larger and larger cargoes over larger and larger distances. So that as you get in, as the 19th century progresses, you get, past the middle of the 1800s, you might have a farmer, out in Wisconsin or out in Canada somewhere, growing a crop of grain, harvesting it, taking it down to the nearest town with a railroad station, 50 miles away or something. And selling it to an agent who's going to put that cargo of, wheat grain or something onto a train that's going to take it to a port city on the coast, is going to put it on the steamship that's going to take it off to London or Paris or someplace where that Canadian wheat is going to wind up getting baked into bread. Okay. This is something that never used to happen, right? Bulk goods, staples of life, not being all locally sourced, but being transported over very long distances in order to be sold far away. And this means a much greater integration of world economies, right? As trade links, the prosperity of farmers in the American Midwest starts getting linked to the price of bread in Paris. Things like that are going to start affecting people over much larger distances. So that's a very major transition in the economy there. Okay, so that's second wave. Again, the transportation technology and the steel, I should also mention steel mining and refining is going to go along with that as a major new area because you need steel to, build the ships and particularly to build all the railroads. Laying all that track down requires an enormous amount of steel. So steel production and the mining and all the other industries associated with it also exploding, of course, across the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so first phase of industrialization, 750 to 1800, England, focused mainly on textiles. Second phase of industrialization, 1820 to 1860, France, Germany, Netherlands, US, adding in transportation and steel. Third wave, you start seeing beginning to happen around 1870 or so, and running over the generation, basically down to World War I, let's say to about 1910 to keep ourselves in good round numbers. So about 1870 to 1910. So that's the chronology, that this following generation. Um, Geographically, much greater expansion of industrialization, basically to the rest of Europe. Southern Europe, places like Spain and Italy are going to start developing factories and railroads. Eastern Europe, places like Poland and Lithuania, Hungary, Russia, they're going to start implementing industrial railroads and factories and the rest of it as well. And also certain other parts in the world, particularly Japan. Japan is going to industrialize very rapidly and very thoroughly. You're going to see experiments in industrialization in other parts of the world. There's a bit of it in the Middle East. There's a bit of it in China, some other places. But outside of Europe and North America, not on as massive a scale as in Japan. Japan is really the poster child of non-Western industrialization. Um, okay, and also as with the others, new products. New kinds of things getting produced in an industrial fashion as the technology is moving forward. Um, Two major areas. One is electricity. People start getting the idea of hooking their steam-driven turbines up to magnets and copper wire and so forth and generating electricity that you can then hook up to light bulbs and heating units and appliances and all sorts of other things. So the telegraph, the telephone, this third wave industrialization is seeing all this kind of thing. It's the age of Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell sort of inventing all these sort of electrical devices to get what had been sort of something that scientists experimented with, going back to the 1700s or earlier, now starting to see industrial applications and products making use of electricity from the 1870s onwards. The other thing is chemistry. A lot of chemicals getting used, cleaning products, different kinds of fuel, new kinds of paints and dyes and household goods, all sorts of things, bleach and Clorox and all this stuff. Sort of the third wave industrialization also sees an explosion of the chemical industry for all sorts of different dimensions there. So that's another major area. So electricity, chemicals, and then the third major new product, which is going to be significant to third wave industrialization, is going to be consumer goods. If you think about those earlier periods, apart from textiles, apart from clothing, most of it was not something that ordinary people would buy in a store. Right, first wave industrialization, you had sort of started to see the production of factory-generated clothing, or at least cloth that people could buy on a retail basis. But no one, your average private individual is not going and buying a railroad or a steamship or anything like that. Third wave industrialization, though, is going to start seeing manufacturing of factory-based manufacturing of ordinary household goods, utensils, tools, appliances, all sorts of things that people use around their home. Probably the perfect symbol of third wave industrialization would be the bicycle, sort of a factory-generated object an ordinary household can buy. It's a huge amount of fun. It's kind of entertaining, and you can also go, riding it around on a practical basis for local transportation. Third wave industrialization, the age of the bicycle is almost a symbol of the era. But really, on a deeper level, the bicycle is symbolic of a lot of other goods starting to come out of the factories for retail consumption, as opposed to just sort of capital, massive capital goods for infrastructure and so forth. So it's very significant that way. Okay. A couple other things to talk about with all this. So between these, three waves of industrialization, by the time you get to the end of the 1800s, industry is everywhere. It's transforming the economies. Um, it's now getting to be the case that a smaller and smaller percentage of the population of industrialized countries is still in traditional farming roles. It's getting down to the point it's becoming 25, 30, 35% in areas. Eventually in the 20th, 21st century, get down to, 5%. But, still, whereas at the beginning, at the end of the Middle Ages, beginning of the modern era, agriculture had been, 85, 90% of the economy. Now it's getting down to becoming, 30%, 25% of the economy, that much of the population being able to feed the rest. You're getting massive growth of urban centers. Urban growth, cities are exploding in their population, becoming much, much, much larger and producing all sorts of challenges and opportunities there that we will also talk about in a future class. There's also some new institutional things that are going on. Um, Initially, I'll take a moment to talk about these. Initially, in first wave industrialization, um, each factory was pretty much a company unto itself. Each one kind of operated independently. Um, Second wave industrialization begins a process of changing that. You begin seeing the rise of the corporation. Right. The reason being that if you think about the way a railroad is going to operate, a factory you could just have, one property in one town, one building, that's your factory. It operates, it produces things. But to run a railroad business, you need to have properties in multiple cities, right? You need an operation which is going to be spread around a whole state or across multiple states or provinces or, across an entire country. Ultimately, that's the whole point, is to be able to move things, from one area to another. And so in second wave industrialization and then bleeding over into third wave industrialization, you see the rise of joint stock corporations using the same old model as the East India Company or what have you, really being multiplied. Many more joint stock corporations getting founded and really expanding in their size and their reach. Largely railroads, railroad companies, which are going to need to sort of hold together multiple holdings in many different cities or across entire countries and coordinate all their activities. You're going to start having sort of central executive offices, headquarters. They're sort of coordinating all these activities, and branch offices selling tickets locally and running maintenance of the tracks locally, and all these much, much, much more complex forms of organization. So the corporation, in our more modern sense, really arising out of industrialization. That's going to be very significant. And another feature going along with that, really starting to happen more in the third phase, although it's also growing out, particularly the railroad industry, is going to be what's called vertical integration of corporations, vertical integration. And Andrew Carnegie, who's Scottish but makes his career in the United States, is kind of the pioneer of this, sort of great rail baron, and then he goes into the steel industry. Carnegie's idea is that, he starts off on railroads and then switches over to the steel industry, which is kind of related to it. And he observes you've got, your mine producing iron ore, and then you're having somebody transport that ore to a refinery, and then somebody else is going to transport the refined steel from the refinery to a factory, and the factory is going to, shape the steel into whatever products, and then it's going to get transported somewhere, to be, sold. Um, and all of these sort of being different businesses. Carnegie's idea is, what if you set up a company which would control all of those stages of the process? Okay, can you set things up so that rather than, having this be 4 or 5 different businesses all negotiating with each other, maybe you can make it more efficient if you bought up all the others. If you're running a refinery, you buy up the transportation operations and make them part of your company. Maybe you buy the factory, which is going to actually, make stuff out of your steel as well. Maybe you're going to start buying the mines, right? And so you wind up with this vertical integration, one single complex corporation, which is not doing just one business or one stage of the process, but is doing the whole thing. And Carnegie's idea is that this will make the process more efficient. You don't have, multiple managements all going on at once. That will allow you to lower prices, which will make you more competitive, which will, drive your competitors out of business and allow you to buy up their businesses and start building this, even larger, massive kind of a corporation. So this is the kind of thing Carnegie is doing. It's very controversial. He is a very tough and aggressive businessman who's quite happy to go around, driving smaller competitors out of business and buying up their companies and kind of hostile takeovers and that sort of thing. But this becomes the new um, the new capitalist mode, new capitalist model is everybody trying to big larger and larger conglomerate corporations that are going to be able to compete in this kind of a way and act in this sort of aggressive way towards each other. Um, Okay, so that's sort of the vertical integration thing. That's sort of on the management side, and we'll talk about Taylorianism, I think maybe a bit later, about sort of inspired by all this and thinking about how to manage them. The other thing is from the laborer side. You start having an issue where, of course, as these factories and railroads and things are trying to make money as much as possible, um, they are also trying to maximize their profits by, paying the workers as little as possible. And conditions are often highly dangerous. Often they're bringing children to work in the factories. Women are working in the factories a lot alongside of men. Whoever they can get for cheapest, very often, and often without any kind of safety precautions and so forth, and very poor conditions for workers often. And this leads to a movement on the part of workers to try to organize themselves in order to negotiate for better pay, for better working conditions, and so forth, to limit the number of hours they may have to work in a week or the number of days of a week. And so this gives rise to the union movement, which is initially very controversial. There had never really been anything like these labor unions before. You have some of the sort of lingering hierarchical instinct that, this is very, very wrong for these lowly people to step up and, make demands from their superiors. You will have cases where governments will send policemen and soldiers to break up unions, break up strikes, try to outlaw unions, things like that. But on the whole, the union movement succeeds in competing or fighting off these efforts to suppress it, and in these sorts of efforts, and does succeed over time, both politically and through negotiation economically, in obtaining progressively better conditions for the workers. Okay, so a lot of different things happening over the course of the late 1700s and over the course of the 1800s with all these different things going on. Thank you very much.